Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. My guest today is Hope Harrison. Hope is an associate professor of history and international affairs at the George Washington University, a former Wilson Public Policy Fellow with the Center's History and Public Policy program, and the author of this book, After the Berlin Wall, Memory and the Making of New Germany, 1989 to Present. Hope, congratulations on the book and welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's great to be here, John.
So, you talk about everything in life being timing. You're on a plane to Berlin.
Yes.
And the pilot announces that the iconic Berlin Wall has fallen.
Yes. I was writing my dissertation on the building of the wall. I had a long planned trip to West Berlin. I got on a plane in New York City on November 9th, touched down in Frankfurt in the morning of November 10th, got a commuter flight to Berlin, and the pilot told us that the wall had fallen overnight and we were flying into history.
The pilot had a good flair for the dramatic there. Flying into history is a great line.
Yes.
What were your thoughts and how did people on the plane react?
Everyone was just jubilant. I mean, people burst into applause. Everyone was reading the newspapers that announced, Die Mauer ist offen, the wall is open. And I had 10 amazing days getting my own pieces of the wall, watching them open new border crossing points, and watching East and West Germans with tears in their eyes, hugging each other, tears of joy.
It was quite a moment. I too had the privilege of going there, not as immediately as you did. Your timing couldn't have been more dramatic. But similarly, brought back a piece of the wall, brought this prop to show our viewers.
That's a great piece.
Yeah, they become, those with paint on them have become, as you know, more and more rare.
They keep painting them. They keep making new, authentic
versions. Exactly, exactly. But to actually have been there early enough to get a real piece. So things transpired pretty quickly then after the fall of the wall, right? Talk to us about what you cover in the book as far as from that moment.
So my book looks at how Germany has grappled with the history and legacy of the wall over the 30 years since it fell. Germany is very well known for openly dealing with its Holocaust past. And now this is a second difficult part of its history that they have dealt with. 28 years the Berlin Wall stood, with Germans shooting other Germans who were trying to escape from east to west. So I look at how Germany has handled that. What have they done to commemorate the victims? What have they done about the perpetrators? Who do they see as heroes of the fall of the wall? I tell stories about individuals to show the variety of ways Germany has dealt with this history.
And one of the things you grapple with is who gets to tell those stories, who gets to define the narrative. What is the official German narrative and who controls that?
The official narrative has changed over time, and that's what I write about. It's in the process of changing again. But my book argues that 10 years ago, for the 20th anniversary, Germans adopted a new narrative that instead of focusing on the people who had been killed at the wall, which they had been focusing on for a while and needed to, they shifted in 2009 to focusing on the heroes who brought down the wall, the courageous East Germans who took to the streets in 1989 demanding change, including freedom of travel, and put pressure on the regime and ultimately led to the opening of the wall. And so I write about this as a really important moment in German history and German identity, in which essentially Germans said, you know what? We have a great story in our contemporary history. We have the terrible Holocaust, and we are not forgetting that. But along with that, we also have things we can be proud of and celebrate, including the East Germans and the peaceful revolution that brought down the Berlin Wall.
That pivot that occurred, how purposeful was that? Or how much of that is some sort of natural evolution of this type of story where initially there's sorrow, there's emotion to be dealt with, there's forgiveness that must take place. And then at some point, the official story uses it almost as an animating feature of the new Germany, as you call it in the book.
Yes.
How purposeful was that pivot?
Well, it came from a regular German citizen, Tom Zello, who's one of the memory activists I write about in my book, who had been a dissident in East Germany. And in United Germany, he felt that not enough people understood really what had happened in 1989 and the pivotal role that East Germans played. And he set out to educate people. He put together a big exhibit to be outside for the 20th anniversary of the fall of the wall in Alexanderplatz. And he got funding from the Berlin government and the federal government. And then they saw this exhibit and they saw this narrative and they embraced it. So it wasn't purposeful in the sense that the leaders thought this up. It was that, someone came to them and said, look, this is what I think is important to highlight in this history. Mm-hmm. And they, ran with it since then.
Is there a gap between the sort of the official narrative and what you talk to the average German? And then similarly, is there a gap between those whose history is in the East versus those whose history is in the West?
People in the West who had no family or friends or specific contacts in the East don't necessarily feel that much about this story, and their lives haven't changed that much since the fall of the wall and unification. They may focus more on the role of the West as attracting the East and the role of West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl than necessarily the East Germans on the streets before the wall fell. Among people in the East, there's certainly many people who subscribe to this narrative and who were part of marching on the streets. But there are others who say, that's a one-sided story. Mm-hmm. Looking at the people, you have to also look at the other side, the people in power, and how they peacefully, willingly gave up that power. And in fact, that story is not told as much as it really needs to be so far in Germany.
Well, why do you think that is? I mean, it's such a unique story. It's not usually the way people cede power.
Exactly. Why did they give up that power? Well, Germany was surrounded by reform. I mean, Mikhail Gorbachev had started in the Soviet Union. He had made it clear that he wanted reforms. He'd also made it clear he wasn't going to intervene in any sort of military way. So he wasn't going to basically send in the tanks to keep the wall closed. That played a role. I also think in neighboring Poland, Solidarity had already trounced the Communist Party. So things were developing, moving away from communism. And I think people saw that, as well as the economy was in shambles. And many people saw that and were having their own doubts about the system. And of course, many of the people in power knew family or friends who were out on the streets marching and saying things have to change.
How has the evolution of the narrative and the remembrance of the fall of the wall and its significance, how has that manifested itself in the public celebrations or commemorations? What was the most recent one like?
Mm-hmm. Well, the 20th and 25th anniversaries in 2009 and 2014 had fireworks. That's the cover of my book, is the 20th anniversary. Huge celebration at the Brandenburg Gate with Chancellor Angela Merkel joined by all the leaders of the EU and the US and Russia. Somewhat more muted, but similarly celebratory for the 25th anniversary. But this week, for the 30th anniversary, there's less of a celebratory mood. There are events happening all week to celebrate it. But there are people in the East who are frustrated that say 30 years after the fall of the wall, we aren't as far as we thought we'd be. We're still not making the same as people in the West are. We're closer, but we're still not making the same. And we feel like we're treated a little bit like second-class citizens.
I remember when I went over there, I was at the time doing a TV program on C-SPAN that focused on young people. we worked a lot with high schools and college age students, and I did a couple of roundtable discussions with students, and those students from the East were expressing this concern, that they were instantly second-class citizens. They felt at a great disadvantage because they knew that much of the education they were receiving was propaganda, Soviet propaganda. They also had a language disadvantage in that they weren't studying English. The second language they were studying was Russian.
Right.
So you're saying 30 years later, that underclass scenario or that paradigm is still in place?
For a minority, but a loud minority. Over 70% of East Germans are happy with unification and where things stand, but there is a vocal minority that says we haven't gotten as much as we thought, and we want the government to pay more attention to us. And in fact, they are. Angela Merkel and other people in her government realize there's a new sense of an East-West divide, and they're doing their best to reach across it.
She has a personal connection in that regard.
Angela Merkel herself was from the East. She had family in the West. She has talked about that. I write a fair amount in my book about her own experience with the wall.
But how has it been, I perhaps should say, politicized, the memory of the wall?
People who were high-level officials in the former regime still say it was a normal border. We had the right to do what we wanted at our sovereign border, and it kept the peace. The far more common majority view is that, it was basically a violation of human rights, stopping freedom of travel and resorting to shooting at people and even killing them to prevent them from crossing that border.
How many people did die in those border crossing incidents?
So at the wall itself, researchers to this day have so far found the identities of 140 people. Of course, the bigger...
And their photos are at a memorial.
Yes, and I write a lot about how they've commemorated victims and how the Berlin Wall Memorial came to be. The broader East German, West German border and East Germany's border at the Baltic coast, where people also tried to escape and were killed, there are estimates of, at least 400 people, but they're actually still doing research now to figure out the identity of those people.
You tell several stories of individuals. Pick a story that you think best illustrates what the average German citizen endured during this period.
The average German citizen, that's hard. But the story I will pick is a father, Horst Schmidt.
It's actually the one I was thinking of when I went fishing.
Whose son, Mikael Schmidt, at the age of 20, on December 1st, 1984, decided he had had enough of East Berlin and wanted to escape to West Berlin. And he made it over the first wall. The Berlin Wall was always two walls with a so-called death strip in between of multiple layers, armed guards with an order to shoot, guard dogs, and other obstacles. He made it over the first wall, and he threw a ladder down to prop up against the second outer wall. If he had gotten over that, he would have been in West Berlin. But just as he propped up that ladder, the two border soldiers there shot 50 shots at him. One of them punctured his lung, and a few hours later he died. So one of the stories I tell is of his father looking for justice for his son after the wall fell and bringing the case to court, and then becoming a co-plaintiff in the trials of the heads of the border guards and, in fact, the political leaders. His father, Horst Schmidt, was a part of all these processes, saying that after the Berlin Wall, what he wanted was justice for his son.
It's impossible, I'm guessing, to generalize in something like this, but is there a sense, largely among the majority of people, that justice has been served over time, or is that still a wound that needs to be addressed?
It's a bit of a wound still. I mean, certainly for people who lost a loved one, you can't bring them back. And in most...
This is recent history. We're not talking ancient history.
Yes, and most of the court cases of the border soldiers themselves who fired the guns, they mostly got suspended sentences because the judges said, yes, they were guilty. They've confessed. We know they're guilty, but they were at the bottom of the command chain. Let's go after the others. So some of the bigwigs got ultimately served 4 or 5 years in jail. For someone like Horst Schmidt, that wasn't enough. But Germany as a whole continues to grapple with this past and try to reconcile. And the German leaders use the history of the wall very much as lessons for today, as lessons of what happens when you have an exclusionary policy, when you have a policy that seeks conformity instead of openness. They point to the wall as an example of that, as a very extreme example of that, and say that German citizens should learn from that and the Holocaust to be active, engaged citizens fighting for democracy and freedom.
Saying I want to look behind the wall would be a tortured metaphor, so I won't go there, but I do want to pull back the curtain on the process of writing a book like this. It's an epic achievement of the scope of history that you cover so thoroughly and even intimately. How long did it take you to write the book?
I was working on it on and off for 15 years. Now, in that period, there were whole years when I didn't touch it because I had administrative positions and was busy doing other things. But it's 15 years of research. It's over 100 interviews I did with individual German citizens who have had influence on how the public history of the wall gets told in public spaces in Berlin, which millions of people come to and learn from, which is why I was curious to know who gets to write that history.
And some of that work occurred here. How do you manage to find oases to take a time out where you can really put yourself fully in the project?
My year at the Wilson Center was a dream. Being able to devote the time to just focusing on writing was essential. Having the time off from teaching and administrative duties and all of that to just sit here and write and use the Library of Congress and interact with other scholars was an absolute dream. And I'm so grateful to the Wilson Center, and this book wouldn't be what it is without that time here.
Well, that's very kind of you, because it's a terrific book. I want to get a final thought from you. And one of the things I've learned since I've come to the Wilson Center and had the opportunity to interview historians like yourself is how, unfortunately, when we're kids in school, history seems like it's a final story.
Yes.
There's a period at the end of the story. And of course, what you learn is that you can erase that period. It's an ongoing tale. You end in the book with a Manfred Fischer quote, "We could never sit still and think our work is finished. We must keep confronting new challenges or we won't matter." Why do you end with that? What does that mean to you in this context?
Well, what it meant to him is that new generations are coming along who know nothing about the wall, who didn't experience the wall. And so you have to show its relevance to them. And when I teach, my students mostly were born since the fall of the wall. And so you can't assume anything. And since the Cold War is over, you can't assume they understand what it was like when Berlin was the center of the Cold War. And so to make it relevant, the idea of restricting freedoms, of political prisoners, which, exist in this world today, the difference between freedom, a real democratic regime, and a regime that is not democratic, the impact that has on people, but of course also the impact of walls. Which have been going up around the world since this wall came down. We're living in a very, very different time.
Yeah, it's almost an era of walls.
Yes.
Literal and in some cases, at least the desire to make them figurative, or I should say figurative, in some cases desire to make them literal.
Yes, and so to give students a sense for this time in history, when the pendulum was swinging toward freedom and bring down the walls, is
Bring down that
important.
wall, Mr. Gorbachev, as Reagan famously said. Well, Hope, congratulations again, and thank you for joining us today for this. This is the author, Hope Harrison, and this is the book. A terrific read.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now and that you'll join us again in the near future. Until then, for all of us at the Center, I'm John Molesky. Thank you for watching.